Today, we're going to continue our discussion of the anti-imperial movement that contributes to the breakdown of these empires. So we talked certainly in the 18th century and in the 19th century, 1700s, 1800s, European nations creating empires that didn't just stretch their boundaries out along the European continent, but actually pushed overseas into Africa, into Asia, into Latin America. We started talking the other day about how we begin to see nationalist movements striving for independence and breaking from these colonial powers. This will continue into the 20th century. We're going to start with talking about a few names that the College Board wants to make sure we have. Yes, 622. A few names that the College Board wants us to have down. We've talked about a couple of them already. Mohandas Gandhi. Now you might see Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma is like a title, all right? It's a position. Mohandas is his first name, but we can call him Gandhi. And then Muhammad Ali Jinnah. We talked about both of these guys. Let's spend a little more time talking about Gandhi. He is an English-educated Hindu. Comes from an upper-class family, an upper-class Indian family. So he gets a law degree in England. And his job in his earlier years, after his education, is as a lawyer in South Africa. So if you want to talk about a guy who was a pretty global figure, born in India, educated in England, which happened to a lot of within the British colony, guys, a lot of upper crust sons of the elite in India would get their educations back in England. All right, this is how they tried to maintain their colony, right? Taking local people, training them up, educating them in the English way, and then they can go back and be like the administrators of the colony for the British. And that's what Gandhi did. He goes to England, he gets a law degree, he goes to South Africa, and he's got a job as a lawyer. After World War II, he goes back to India, and he becomes a leader of the Indian nationalist movement. He joins that Indian National Congress, the INC. We mentioned that the other day. It was born in the late 1800s. He joins the INC, and he becomes an advocate for Indian self-rule, for Indian nationalism. Yes? Indian National Congress. And whenever you see pictures of Gandhi, you are, especially once we're talking in the 1920s and 30s, we are going to see him in just very traditional and very simple clothing, right? Like just cloth draped over him. And this isn't what the elite wore in India. The elite in India, even Indian elites, would be wearing suits and ties because they would want to look like the elite in England. But he shed all that. And this would make him far more appealing to the masses in India. Because remember, the majority of people in India, very, 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 very poor. And he would look like them. All right? He would look more traditional. And this gained some appeal. He didn't look like some upper crust elite that created the Indian National Congress. He looked like every man. And now that he looked like every man, he started to get every man to follow him. The masses started to follow his leadership. His symbol, as in the push for Indian nationalism, became the traditional Indian spinning wheel that Indians had used for centuries to create their own cloth from their own Indian cotton. And this becomes a symbol of the Indian nationalist movement because what had the British been doing? Yeah, British had been taking the Indian cotton, and remember the production of cotton in India, which had been there for millennia, the production of cotton in India was commoditized. It was taken out of India, or the production remained in India, the cotton was taken out of India, but we began to see the growth of essentially factory farms, massive cotton farms in India, displacing traditional farms that produced food for Indians. Remember, we talked about the Indian famine in the 19th century, right? We talked about a massive famine, millions dying from it. Well, Gandhi wants to bring it back. Don't take our cotton to put into British textiles, to make clothing, to then ship back to India, to sell to Indians at an inflated price. Don't do that. We can go back to making our own. And Gandhi famously made his own cotton. This is one little example of civil disobedience, or what we could also refer to as passive resistance of Gandhi. Britain wants to sell Indians British-produced cloth. Gandhi says, no, we'll do our own. We'll make our own. In 1929, also, another seminal moment in Gandhi's revolutionary movement is what's known as the Salt March. In 1929, Gandhi and some of his followers walked for 80 miles to the sea where they could collect salt.
What year was it?
1929. The years aren't important. In 1929, he takes a few of his followers, marches 80 miles to the sea to collect salt, in opposition to the British, who had a monopoly on the salt trade. I said that word funny. That came out odd. A monopoly on the salt trade in India. The British wanted Indians to buy salt from British companies, from British producers, not getting it on their own. And this is another example of Gandhi's civil disobedience and passive resistance that would ultimately be successful in gaining popular support and ultimately gets Britain to leave their colony in 1947, leave it to independence. Now, it's also important to mention Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who is going to break from Gandhi. Muhammad Ali Jinnah was a leader of the Muslim League. The Muslim League advocated not only for independence from Britain, but for Muslim independence from Britain. The Muslim League was concerned that if Britain left, if India got its independence, with the majority of the Indian subcontinent being Hindu, that the Muslims in India would be mistreated or disenfranchised or abused in a Hindu state. So Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the Muslim League advocated not only for Indian independence, but actually for the independence of Muslims within that. His work will ultimately lead to the separation of India and Pakistan. I don't have it there. I thought I had a map there. The separation of India and Pakistan, we'll get to it in a second, the separation of India and Pakistan into two independent nations after the 1947 independence movements by Britain. Okay, good. So we've got an independence movement from Gandhi. Gandhi was pushing for a secular independence. And as I mentioned the other day, that's what's going to frustrate some Hindus in India who ultimately assassinate Gandhi because they didn't want it to be a secular movement. Muhammad Ali Jinnah didn't want a secular movement. He wanted a separate Islamic state. Yes? That's not really a big deal for AP World History. It makes sense, like having one country that is like geographically separate from each other. That's challenging, right? Good. All right. Another nationalist leader the College Board wants you to be familiar with, and we've already spoken of him, is Ho Chi Minh. Now, Ho Chi Minh is a taken name. It's not his given name.
He's in the win.
Like Tyler, Ho Chi Minh is one of millions of wins in Vietnam. But he takes the name Ho Chi Minh and Tyler, can you help me out here? Because I know that like this Minh part of it is all about like national independence, right? Is there an absolute definition, a strict definition?
Ho relates to the soul because the word ho is translated from the Chinese word which means from the soul, and Chi means the will. Chi means the will to, and then Minh, it's like nationalist relating to Vietnam, so like the will and the soul to be
so the people and all of their being pushing for nationalism that the name Ho Chi Minh takes. So Ho Chi Minh is a Vietnamese nationalist leader. We've already talked about him. He's educated as well. And after World War I, he goes to France to advocate for Vietnamese independence at the Paris Peace Conference. And of course, the French say, no. Right? Probably just like that. They're not going to listen to him. So he becomes disenchanted with Western imperialism and colonialism in the hope that Vietnamese on their own could ever gain independence. He begins to read the writings of Marx and Lenin and begins to support a communist ideology in his push for nationalism. He goes back to Vietnam in the 1930s, and at this point we see Vietnam getting invaded by Japan in World War II, and he leads nationalist Vietnamese in their fight during World War II against the French and the Japanese. After World War II, he declares Vietnamese independence, but the French aren't going to give that to him. And so he will lead a war against the French for 9 years, from 1945 to 1954. 10 years. 1945 to 1954. Before they ultimately are victorious, and we will see a divided Vietnam. This is where North Vietnam and South Vietnam come from. Ho Chi Minh will become the leader of an independent North Vietnam. And if we fast forward the story very quickly, if you guys recall, we talked the other day, North Vietnam and South Vietnam will go to war against each other. The United States supports South Vietnam, and ultimately the North win that conflict. And today there's one independent Vietnam. Now, Ho Chi Minh dies in the late 60s, so he doesn't ever see that unification of Vietnam, but he certainly is the inspiration for it, and he's essentially the George Washington for the Vietnamese people. In fact, the city that Tyler comes from, Saigon, upon the defeat of South Vietnam, officially became renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Yes? They were separate, yes. This is a part of the Cold War story. The northern part of the country became, under Ho Chi Minh's rule, communist. The southern part of the country was not communist. And there was an agreement at the end of that French war. This is stuff too deep for AP World. But at the end of that war with France, there was an agreement that within 2 years there would be a unifying election to bring the country together. But the people in the South, the people ruling the South and the United States, never wanted that unifying election to take place because it was believed that he would have overwhelmingly won. And so no one wanted that election to take place. It never took place, and that's where the new war is going to be born out of. All right, we press on. Two other leaders you should be familiar with. In Africa. Now remember, all of the African continent virtually was taken over by European powers. And of course, there will be an African nationalist movement as well. These are two leaders that you guys should be familiar with, and I hope you can just recognize by seeing the names. If you see them on an AP exam, you will recognize that names like Kwame Nkrumah and names like Jomo Kenyatta are African names. And Kwame Nkrumah will be a nationalist leader of what will become the nation of Ghana in West Africa. And do you note that the new independent nation of Ghana, we'll talk more about Ghana in a couple minutes here, takes the name of one of the original great kingdoms of West Africa. Remember Ghana, Mali, Songhai? Remember we talked about those? Gold and salt trade back in the post-classical era. So the modern nation of Ghana, same rough area, takes the name of the historic nation of Ghana. And Jomo Kenyatta, anyone want to take a guess as to what country? Very good. Becomes the first leader of an independent Kenya. We'll talk more about these movements in a moment. We're also going to discuss today, in pushes for these independence from colonial powers, new movements that transcend national boundaries, that go beyond the lines that had been drawn in the sand. Because we want to remember that the lines that we see on maps, many of them are based on like geographic borders, like where there are rivers or where there are mountains. Some of them are based on ethnic boundaries, but many of them, especially the lines drawn on the old colonies, are totally arbitrary, right? European guys got together, drew some lines on a map, And that was the boundary of the colonies. Without any regard for ethnic divisions or language barriers or anything like that. They were drawn to suit the needs of Europeans rather than to suit the needs of the people in those areas. So I'm gonna give you three transnational nationalist movements. And they're all going to start with the prefix pan. Because if we were Greek, we would know that the prefix pan means all. Okay? Like, oh, look at that, yeah! I never thought of that one. I was thinking pantheon, which is, you guys have heard the word pantheon? Like if you were in ancient Rome, if you were to go to the Pantheon, that's where you would go and worship all the gods. But then did someone just say Pangea? Like, yeah. So like, remember back in the day, like this is, we're going back, what? Hundreds of millions of years, billions of years, pardon me. We're going back billions of years when all of the land masses were kind of united in one entity. There we go. So we're going to start with Pan-Slavism. Now this is the one that really is probably the least important in developing new nations. But Pan-Slavism is the idea that all Slavic peoples, all people of Slavic heritage, have a common background, common language roots, common ethnic roots. And we mentioned the other day that this idea of Pan-Slavism is going to be used by Russia in their support of the Slavic peoples of the Balkan Peninsula. This down here in southern Europe, southeastern Europe, is called the Balkan Peninsula. And one country within the Balkan Peninsula is Serbia. And you guys remember me talking the other day how Russia said to Serbia, we'll get your back if Austria pushes you around. Because the Russians celebrate this idea of Pan-Slavism, but then they also wanted to get closer to the Mediterranean Sea. All right? So there's a little bit of an ulterior motive there. So Pan-Slavism, a movement of Slavic peoples to be more united and stand up for each other. Now, this is not a perfect scenario. And this one really doesn't last very long in the push for more independent nations. For example, Poland, what you see as the modern Poland, those are Slavic peoples. But Russia doesn't want Polish independence. Right? And we see that in the story of World War II when the Soviet Union agrees to divide up Poland with Germany. We talked about that the other day. PanArabism. PanArabism. Arab people are from Arabia. This is going to blow your minds, right? Arab people originate in Arabia. How do Arab people get all the way over here? The spread of Islam, okay? In that, remember that first century of Islam, the first century after the birth of Islam, Islamic armies will spread out of Arabia and conquer all of the Middle East, much of the Middle East, and all of North Africa. And so you get Arab roots, Arab people, the Arab language stretching across this region. And the Arab language is going to take such root because, remember, the Arab language is the language of Islam, right? Like the Quran is to be read and recited in Islam. So, rewind, edit this. When I hire an editor, we're going to fix this. You guys, this is where you should be calling me out when I say bad things. The Islamic religion is the Quran is to be read in Arabic. Whatever. I'm ready for this all to be over. So, yes, ma'am. Very good, very good. So a guy like Martin Luther who says, no, we should be able to read this in German. Yeah, and you can imagine there's going to be a lot of illiterate Arabs who aren't really going to be reading the Quran for themselves. Absolutely, absolutely. But I think, okay, so there is a similarity. The difference is most of the Christian world today has said, yeah, read it in your own language. Whereas Islam has stayed to that tradition of the Quran being recited in Arabic. Anyway, so the idea of Pan-Arabism is to unite all of these disparate Arab states. Because if we look across North Africa, for example, Morocco and Algeria, those were colonies of France. Libya was a colony of Italy. Britain had control of Egypt. Britain and France are eventually going to take control of much of the rest of the Middle East. And so the idea of Pan-Arabism is, hey, why don't we kind of unite in what we do have in common, our common Arab heritage, our common Arab language, and unite, and then we will be much stronger, all right? There's an Egyptian leader of the 1950s and 60s that you should be familiar with. His name is Gamal Abdel Nasser. Call him Nasser. Just put in your book. Egyptian leader Nasser. 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 He's a leader of Egypt in the 1950s and 60s. But he sees himself not only as being a leader of Egyptians, but wanting to be a leader of a united Arab world. And in fact, don't write this down, just hear it. For a brief time, Egypt and Syria will join with each other to become what is called the United Arab Republic. But he would like to make that much bigger. It never works. It never actually happens, because guess what? Algerians are different from Egyptians, who are different from Iraqis. There's a lot of other differences between these people, beyond the similarities that they have in their common Islamic religion or their common Arabic language. So a united Arab land never actually develops. But it's a movement that gets a lot of talk and gets a lot of support, certainly for independence. Yes?
Is Pan-Arabism and Nasser have to do with the Ba'ath Party and all that?
No, they're separate from the Ba'ath Party. Ba'ath Party is in Syria and then in Iraq. And actually it's the Ba'ath Party that says, we don't want to be with Nasser, we want to do our own thing. Yes?
So what's your countries in the United Arab Republic?
Syria and Egypt. That will never come up on your AP World exam. All right. Finally, one other pan, the Pan-African Movement. The Pan-African Movement. And as we've already said, the entirety of the African continent was colonized by European powers, except for two countries, right?
Ethiopia.
Very good. Ethiopia and Liberia, which is kind of an interesting case, a special case, because Liberia was actually created by freed American slaves. So that in its own right was kind of a colony of its own, not what it originally was. But anyway, Liberia and Ethiopia. And then what did we even mention about Ethiopia in 1935-36? We mentioned it the other day. Italy went to take over Ethiopia, right, in the advent of the Second World War. So by the time we get to the 1940s, virtually all of the African continent is colonized by European powers. But in World War I, Britain and France, especially Germany as well, was using their colonies to support their war effort. The French were bringing African soldiers to the Western Front to fight and die for France. Britain was bringing British subjects to fight and die for Britain. And these African subjects of these colonial powers said, whoa, look what the Europeans are all about. They're massacring each other. And then they're sending us to our own massacre. We should be independent. And in the interwar years, in between World War I and World War II, we see the first meetings held in Europe, ironically enough, of what's known as the All-African People's Conference, where Western-educated Africans would meet and advocate for the independence of Africa. And we can see this, hands off Africa. Africa must be free. And so they begin to meet to discuss independence of African states. Yes?
So the idea was that they want to be, sorry, can you state the idea?
Independent of colonial rule. They want to drive out European powers. The final meeting of this conference takes place in 1945, which is also the last year of the Second World War. And in the Second World War, these colonies will also be exploited and used by the European powers in order to fight and ultimately win that war for Britain and France. But the Second World War does far more for African independence, because the Second World War virtually bankrupts Britain, virtually bankrupts France. And after the Second World War, we are going to combine the long-lasting desire for African nations to gain their independence, combine that with the inability of Britain and France to maintain their colonies. It can be expensive to maintain colonies. Britain and France can't afford it anymore. The benefit they're gaining from holding these colonies is not worth the cost of maintaining them, especially in light of growing anti-colonial movements. Because anti-colonial movements, people start protests, right? They have rallies. Sometimes people get angry. You might have to send in the police or the army to quell disturbances. That's all very expensive. And after World War II, Britain and France and Belgium and other European countries can't afford it anymore. All right? So we see ultimately the success of these African independence movements in the aftermath of World War II. Ghana will be the first nation to gain its independence. Ghana will be the first nation to gain its independence. And following Ghana, and that comes in 1957, led by Kwame Nkrumah. And he will use his experience in gaining the independence for Ghana to then push to other nations to gain independence in the aftermath of Ghana. So by the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, virtually the entirety of the African colony, certainly sub-Saharan Africa, will be gaining their independence. Other colonies will come a little bit later in the 1970s with their independence. But today, all of Africa is represented by independent African states. There's going to be some problems from this independence. We're going to talk about this a little bit more later. But if we recall, the lines that African colonialists, or the European colonialists of Africa, the lines that they drew, if we recall, remember the Berlin Conference in the 1880s? The lines that the European powers drew between their colonies were often quite arbitrary. Look at Sudan and Egypt, for example. Kind of a straight line drawn across it. Look at the borders between Chad and Sudan. Just zigzaggy straight. These are lines not drawn with respect to national boundary or to ethnic groups, not drawn with respect to geographic boundaries. These are lines drawn by Europeans in the 19th century with rulers and straight edges, right? Just putting lines on maps, saying this is ours, that can be yours. And this is going to result in tremendous ethnic conflict, as ethnic groups are going to be squeezed together into new independent nations without the Europeans overseeing them. When the Europeans are there with their armies and their guns, they can keep the ethnic groups divided. They can stop any protests. They can stop any riots. But once the Europeans leave and the Africans are left with their own self-rule, we will start to see ethnic groups within these new nations clamoring for their own control of the nations. And much ethnic conflict and strife will result. These conflicts continue to today. Sudan used to be the biggest geographic nation in Africa. Today, there is no Sudan. Well, there's a Sudan, but it's almost half the size. There's Sudan and now South Sudan. Because the northern part of Sudan was primarily Muslim, and the southern part of Sudan was primarily Christian. And they have spent much of the last 20 years warring against each other. In the last couple of years, they broke, and South Sudan became a new and independent nation. So the impact of the old colonial rule is still impacting the planet today. All right, a couple other notes to talk about. In Africa and in South America, Latin America, communism will be another transnational idea that will gain support. Remember how I mentioned that Ho Chi Minh, when France rejected Vietnamese independence, Ho Chi Minh was attracted to the communist idea. Because the communist idea rejects Western capitalism. And it was much of that Western capitalism that led to the colonial world, to the empires being created. Remember, Western capitalism and the need for resources exploited these worlds, African and in the Americas, and South Asia and Southeast Asia. So communism in the 1950s and 60s will spread in Africa and in South America. One, as an ideology, as an anti-colonial ideology. But two, more practical, the Soviet Union and China are going to pump money into these countries to try to gain communist allies around the world. Good? So, a few nationalist leaders are now in our toolbook, and now a few transnational movements. Pan-Slavism, Pan-Arabism, Pan-Africanism, and even communism as movements that transcend national boundaries. All right. Now we're going to push into 623. We're almost done. Relax, relax. We're so close to the end here.
Did you talk about the rest here in 6?
Mm-hmm.
Did you talk about the rest here in 6? Right
Not today, but I'm going to do 623 right now. All right. 623. With all of this political change, with the boundary lines that will be redrawn because of World War I and because of World War II, because of the independence movements that will take place, we are going to see tremendous resettlements of populations, mass migrations of people because of boundary changes. And there's a couple examples the College Board wants us to discuss. First, with the partition of British India into India and Pakistan. And remember, this is Pakistan originally. Today, this is Pakistan and Bangladesh. But this was the original Pakistan, and then the rest is India. When India becomes partitioned, millions of Muslims in India will move to the new Muslim nations. All right? So it's a mass movement of Muslims, and now not all. Today, guys, one of the most populous, I think we mentioned this before. You guys know what the most populous Muslim nation in the world is? Indonesia. It's Indonesia. I think we mentioned that at the beginning of the year. It's very far away from where you would think the most populous Muslim nations would be, like around the Middle East. And then India is number 2, or Pakistan, pardon me, is number 2, and then India is number 3. Yes?
Does Christians in like the Pakistan when it formed, did they move over to as Muslims are moving over? Or?
Yeah, you know what? I don't know how many Christians, I don't think there were many Christians at all that lived in this area. I can't speak to that directly. Most Christians in India are in the south along the coast, which half of our class will let you know, in this area. So in Christian, while Islam is a large majority in India, or pardon me, a large minority in India, Christianity is a very small minority in India. So they're not going to get their own state. They're too small to get their own state. So one movement of people are the millions of Muslims who will move into the now Muslim part of South Asia called Pakistan. Also want you to be familiar with something called the Zionist Movement.
Oh, yeah.
Now again, this is something that I teach my seniors a lot more detail on, but you guys just sit back for a moment and hear about the Zionists. In the 19th century, there were millions of Jews in Eastern Europe. All right? And this needs to be mentioned. It's kind of crazy today because today there aren't millions of Jews in Eastern Europe. We'll talk about the Holocaust in a few minutes. All right? There were millions of Jews in Eastern Europe. It was a large religious minority in Eastern Europe, primarily in Russia and what will become eventually the nation of Poland. In the late 1800s, anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish racism, especially in Russia, would be on a dramatic rise. All right? You guys might remember when you were little kids, you watched a movie called An American Tail. You ever remember this movie? About a little mouse and his family that wanted to go to America? No? Are you guys too young for this? Okay, whatever. It's a big deal when I was a little kid. Anyway, what you didn't recognize is that was a Jewish mouse. And he was living in Russia. He was living in Russia and he was being persecuted. This goes back to the assassination of a Tsar in 1881. And following the assassination of the Tsar Alexander in 1881, the Russian government allowed attacks against Jews in Russia to increase. They didn't stop them, these riots against Jewish populations. So Jews in Russia started getting a really rough treatment. And many of them started to flee. Remember in AP US history, you talked about the migration to America in the 1880s and 1890s, coming primarily from Eastern and Southern Europe. A lot of those Eastern Europeans, a lot of them were Jews, searching for religious freedom and the end to persecution. Some of them, most of those Jews that left Eastern Europe went west, went to Western Europe, Britain, went across the Atlantic to America, to New York City. Some of them started to move to Palestine. Palestine is here in the Eastern Mediterranean. Palestine is like the traditional and biblical homeland for the Jews. But that you have to go back 2,000 years for that. Remember the Romans smashed the Jewish temple and the Jewish diaspora spread the Jews around the world? They'd been gone for a couple thousand years. Well, as they started getting rough treatment in Russia in the late 1800s, some started to go to Palestine. And this became the beginning of what is known as the Zionist Movement. Zionism is Jewish nationalism. The wanting for a Jewish homeland in the traditional Jewish homeland of Palestine. And so we begin to see initially just hundreds and then thousands of Jews moving to Palestine in the late 1800s and very early 1900s. All right? This would grow tremendously after World War I. Because remember, who controlled all this land during World War I and before?
Ottomans.
It was all Ottoman land. And the Ottoman Empire, as we talked about, chose poorly, and they allied with Germany in World War I, and they lost. And at the end of World War I, the brand new League of Nations, established after World War I to try to keep international peace, the brand new League of Nations took all of the Ottoman lands of the Middle East and divided it between France and Britain. Now why? Because France and Britain won the war. But they can't call these colonies, because colonies are like forbidden now. Colonies used to be a thing that you talked about in the 1800s, but in the New World, we can't talk about taking over new colonies. The war wasn't supposed to be fought to make Britain and France stronger. So they're not going to be called colonies, they're going to be called mandates. The idea of the mandates, and there will be mandates in the Middle East, there'll also be mandates in Africa, from former German colonies in Africa. The idea of mandates is much like a parent raising a child. My kids are little, they're like 8 years old and 10 years old. They can't survive in the world, so I raise them up, I teach them how to be adults, and we will send them one day away in hopes that they never come back to our basement.
But then you don't
All right?
take oil for every child.
That's the idea of the League of Nations mandates. That these places had so long been dominated by outside powers. The Ottoman Empire had controlled this territory for centuries. They weren't ready for independence. So the British and the French would hop in there, and they would raise them up and teach them how to be independent nations. And when they were ready, they would let them fly free in hopes that they would never come back to live in Britain's basement. All right? Syria and Lebanon, what becomes Syria and Lebanon, would go to the French for French control, and Britain would gain Palestine, what becomes Jordan, what becomes Iraq. Now, mental note, keep this in mind. There are ulterior motives here. If we notice what the British mandate does, is it gives Britain an unbroken line from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. Britain had hoped to build some railroads across there because that's going to give them better access to India. All right? So there's other goals here. This is the mandatory land. During World War I, though, Britain had promised this to Arabs. Yeah, Britain had made promises of this land for an Arab kingdom. And so you're going to get some angry Arabs. But also during World War I, Britain promised some of this to Jews. Or at least they promised to Jews in a document called the Balfour Declaration. They promised the Jews that they would work to create a national homeland for Jews in Palestine. And when the Jews of Europe heard this, they're like, sweet, we're going to start moving to Palestine because the British are going to help us build a national homeland. And as more and more Jews would move to Palestine, you will get more and more Arabs like, whoa, where are you all coming from? This is a small country, and there's not a lot of land, and there's not a lot of jobs, and the more Jews that come in makes that more of a threat, an economic threat to us. All right? In 1948, this will all ultimately erupt in another war. In 1948, this will erupt in another war in Palestine between the Jews that want to create an independent nation, today we call it Israel, and Arabs that don't want the creation of an independent Israeli nation. The end of that war will result in an independent Israel, and with the Palestinians getting no country. We'll talk more about that in a moment, okay? In addition to the colonial movements, we will see tremendous ethnic violence in the 20th century. Tremendous ethnic violence on a scale unparalleled in world history. There are two wars in the 20th century that rank number 1 and 2 in being the most violent conflicts in human history. World War II first, First World War second. And out of these wars, we will see tremendous ethnic violence. All right? In World War I, Armenian people. Now, Armenians, if I can go back to this map, it's in there a little bit. The Armenian people, this is not a great map to look at, the Armenian people lived in the Ottoman Empire, right at the border between the Ottoman Empire and Russia. The Armenians are Christians. All right? Armenians are Christians. Like Kim Kardashian. Yeah, Kim Kardashians they're Armenians. Pretty much anybody on the planet with a IAN. This is AP World History, right? True, yeah. Anyone on the planet with an IAN at the last end of their name. This is where people will come up with contradictions to this, but most of them are Armenian people. So the Armenians are right on the border between the Ottoman Empire and Russia. But the Armenians are Christians. What are the majority of the Ottoman Empire? Muslim. What's the majority of Russia?
Orthodox.
Christian, right? So when World War I starts, the Ottoman Empire is probably rightfully so suspicious of the Armenians and where their allegiances lie. Are they going to be down with the Russians? Are they going to be down with the Ottomans? In fact, they were kind of down with the Russians, all right? What results from that is one of the worst genocides of the 20th century, and in fact, what is considered the first genocide of the 20th century. The Armenian genocide. Now, this is a touchy subject, because the nation of Turkey today still has not accepted the existence of this as an event. And this becomes a major political issue. Because, like, for example, the United States wants Turkey as an ally. But the United States calls this an Armenian genocide. And this becomes an issue in our relationship with the modern nation of Turkey, which is very important to our connection to the Middle East. The Armenian genocide will result in the killing of millions of Armenians. Here is a picture of a forced march of Armenians from their home way up here, way up here, pardon me, way up here, all the way down to Syria, where millions will die along that march. All right? Second genocide you guys should be familiar with, which I know you all are because I think you're taught it virtually every year of your education, the Holocaust. Adolf Hitler's quest to eliminate European Jewry. Will result in the death of 6 million Jews and the virtual end to Jewish populations in Europe. Now, there are still Jews in Europe today, but they are a fraction. It is a tiny fraction of what once existed. All right? But, to connect this to with what we just spoke about, after World War II, when these camps are liberated, and many of these people are free to go home, where do you think they feel like their home is? Yeah, many of them lost it. Because many of these people are in camps not just because the Nazis rounded them up, but because their Polish neighbors outed them, or their French neighbors outed them, or their Swiss neighbors outed them. All right? We hear a lot about how there's the Anne Frank story, but that is the reason that story is so well known is because it's so rare. All right? There are countless more stories of neighbors turning in neighbors who ended up here. So many of these people, even though they might have come from Romania or Hungary or Poland or France, didn't want to go back to those places where their neighbors had done this to them. And so some will try to head to the United States or Canada or Australia or South America. Some will head to Palestine in hopes of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine where Jews had now been migrating for decades. So as more and more Jews go to Palestine after the Holocaust, and the rest of the world looks at the Holocaust and says, hey guys, we didn't like you. The world was anti-Semitic, all right? Henry Ford in our community was one of the most rabid anti-Semites in the United States. Out of his publishing house in Dearborn, he was pushing out anti-Semitic propaganda for the world to read, all right? Yes, ma'am. Anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish racism. Anti-Jewish racism. So many Jews started going to Palestine, and the rest of the world said, hey, you know what? We might not have been great with the Jews in our own countries, but nobody expected or wanted this to be done to 6 million people. So the world came out and said, we can help you out, Jews. Britain has got this mandate of Palestine, right? Britain has got this mandate of Palestine. The year is 1947. Britain is broke as a joke after World War II, and they certainly can't afford to maintain a colony that's now in conflict between its Arabs and its Jewish population. So Britain will hand Palestine over to the United Nations, a new international organization created after World War II to try to keep the peace. And this is the first situation that they get to deal with. And the United Nations decides, let's divide it into 2 countries. One country for Jews, one country for Arabs. The Jews are like, high five, that works for us. Because the Jews used to have nothing, now they get a country. The Arabs say, nuts to that, why do we have to give up anything? Right? Like, Tyler has $10. David wants some money. I solved the problem by taking Tyler's money, giving David $6 and giving him $4. David's happy because he gets something when he once had nothing. Tyler's like, what? How does this happen? All right? And so war will break out in 1948 between Arabs and Jews in Palestine. And the new nation of Israel will win that war. All right? The new nation of Israel will win that war. For our purposes, that's enough. Let's throw one more horrid genocide at you. In the 1990s, ethnic conflict in the nation of Rwanda, R-W-A-N-D-A. Ethnic conflict in the nation of Rwanda, which was a former Belgian colony. It was a part of the Belgian Congo Empire. The nation of Rwanda was divided between 2 ethnic groups. the majority Hutu, H-U-T-U, and the minority Tutsi, T-U-T-S-I. Hutus and Tutsis. Now, when the Belgians were in control, they gave a lot of colonial power and responsibility to, who do you think they would give it to, the minority group or the majority group?
Minority.
Who says majority? Makes sense, doesn't it? Who says minority? Why are you thinking minority?
Because they did it.
Because they did it. Yes. Okay. Spoiler alert. They did. They gave power. Why, if you are going to be a colonial power, would you give power to the minority? Yes.
Because you don't want the majority to get together and try to break away.
Very good. You make the minority feel special, and they will show their allegiance to you, and at the same time, you keep the majority weak. Right? The majority can like overpower you because they're the majority. So give the power to the minority, make them feel special, and then they will dominate. The majority power will keep the majority power down. Well, with the Belgians gone, violence between Hutu and Tutsis, and the Tutsi population, they're a little bit higher on the status. They got a little more education. They had a little more control of the economy. Hutus are angry about this now. And in the 70s and 80s, there's a lot of violence between these two groups. In the 90s, it blows up into one of the worst disasters of the 20th century, called the Rwandan genocide, where millions of Hutus will massacre the Tutsi population in Rwanda. So, yes, ma'am. Hutus were majority, Tutsis were the minority. Tutsis had the power, Hutus wanted it, Hutus massacred the Tutsis. All right? Last note before we go to lunch, guys. All of this ethnic conflict, all of the wars of the 20th century will lead to the displacement of populations. Not just people killed, but people being like forced out of what was once their traditional homeland. And here's where we go back to the story of the Palestinians. That war that we just talked about, that was fought between Jews and Arabs in 1948 and 1949. The Jews win. Israel wins. There is no Palestinian country that will be formed. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians will flee their homes or be driven out of their homes because of the war, or will be scared out of their homes because they fear that the war could come to them and their families could be in danger. 750,000 Palestinians took refuge in tent cities, camps like this. Today, these refugee camps still exist. And now the 750,000 have had kids and grandkids and great-grandkids that are still considered refugees. And they want to be able to return to their traditional homeland, which is now the Israeli nation. And that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. At the same time that this happened, the Jews of Iraq, the Jews of Egypt, the Jews of Saudi Arabia and Syria and Jordan, who had been there for centuries, right? Remember the diaspora, Romans smashed the temple, Jews go everywhere. They're throughout the Middle East, right? The Jews of all the Arab nations, after this war, they all saw persecution and anti-Semitism against them on the rise. Today, there are no Jews in Iraq. There are no Jews in Syria or Jordan or Saudi Arabia or Egypt. A handful in Egypt still, but hardly any. And they all fled. Where do they go? Israel. Israel passes a law that welcomes them in because Israel wants to grow its population. So where there would be a Jewish refugee crisis, Israel accepted them all in. Where there would be a Palestinian refugee crisis, it still exists today. Because the land that they want to go back to is now a new nation.